The dust rose in clouds around Sarah's feet as she stumbled forward, her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen face. The stones were small, mostly, the kind that bruised rather than broke, but there were enough hands throwing them that it hardly mattered. She could taste blood where her lip had split, could feel the hot trickle down her temple where something sharper had found its mark. "Baron Womb," someone shouted from the crowd gathered in the town square of Bitter Springs. 3 times, and not a son among them. Sarah's knees hit the packed earth, and she curled inward, making herself small. Somewhere behind the ring of angry townspeople, she could hear her daughters crying. Mary, just 5 years old, and the twins barely 3. Their voices cut through the jeers and accusations like knives to her heart, but she couldn't go to them. Not now. Not when the whole town had decided she needed to be taught a lesson. It had been 2 days since Thomas had thrown her out. 2 days since he'd stood on the porch of what used to be her home and declared their marriage dissolved. She'd given him 3 daughters, he'd announced to anyone who would listen, and wasn't that proof enough that she was cursed? What kind of woman couldn't produce a single son? His father needed grandsons to work the farm. The family name needed carrying on. Sarah had failed at the one job God had given her, and he was done waiting. The church ladies had nodded their agreement. The men had clapped Thomas on the back and offered condolences that he'd wasted so many years on a defective wife. By noon, Sarah's own mother had sent word that she needn't come home. The shame was too great. The whole family would suffer if they took her in now. So Sarah had done the only thing she could. She'd gathered her 3 little girls, bundled them in the thin blankets Thomas had grudgingly allowed her to take, and walked into town. Maybe someone would take pity. Maybe the minister's wife would let them sleep in the church basement. Maybe she could find work washing dishes at the hotel. Instead, she'd found this. A mob that had been waiting for permission to unleash their judgment. Margaret Hutchins had thrown the first stone, her face twisted with righteous fury. Others had followed quickly. Now Sarah crouched in the dirt, tasting dust and blood, while the good people of Bitter Springs delivered their verdict on her worthlessness. That's enough. The voice cut through the chaos like a blade through butter. Deep. Quiet. Absolutely certain. Sarah didn't look up. Couldn't. Her head was ringing, and the world had narrowed to the small space between her body and the ground. But she heard the sudden silence that fell over the square. Heard the shuffle of feet as people stepped back. I said that's enough. Boots appeared in her limited field of vision. Good leather boots, dusty from riding but well-made and solid. They stopped directly in front of her, putting themselves between Sarah and the crowd. Now hold on, Caleb, a man's voice called out. Thomas's voice. This ain't your business. Woman's my wife, and if I say she needs correction. Ex-wife, from what I heard. The deep voice held no inflection, no judgment, just a statement of fact. You dissolved the marriage yesterday. Told everyone in town she wasn't yours anymore. Well, that don't mean some stranger can just. You're right. I'm not a stranger. Been ranching 20 miles north of here for 8 years now. You all know me well enough. The boots didn't move. Sarah realized she was staring at them, these solid leather anchors in a world that had turned to chaos. And I know you well enough to know this isn't justice. This is a mob. She's cursed. Margaret Hutchins's shrill voice rang out. 3 daughters and no sons. It's unnatural. My wife bore me no children at all before she died. The quiet voice somehow carried to every corner of the square. Guess that made her cursed too. Or maybe it just made her human. Same as all of us. Sarah felt rather than saw him crouch down. A hand entered her vision, palm up, offered but not demanding. She could see the calluses, the weathered tan of someone who worked outside in all seasons. Strong fingers, but they weren't clenched into a fist. He said, and his voice was gentler now, though still carrying that undertone of absolute certainty. Can you stand? She tried. Got her hands underneath her and pushed, but her arms were shaking too badly. The world tilted, and she would have fallen if those strong hands hadn't caught her shoulders, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Thomas, those girls are crying themselves sick over there," the man said, still holding Sarah upright. "Have the decency to bring them here. Now you listen. Bring them here." Something in those 3 words made it clear this wasn't a request. Sarah heard Thomas mutter something under his breath, but then there were small feet running, and suddenly Mary was throwing her arms around Sarah's waist, sobbing, with the twins clutching at her skirt. The man, Caleb, they'd called him, slowly released Sarah's shoulders once he was sure she wouldn't fall. He straightened and turned to face the crowd. Sarah, still on her knees with her daughters pressed against her, finally looked up at him. He was tall, which he'd expected from the voice. Broad-shouldered under a work-worn coat. Dark hair touched with grey at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but solid. Real. A face you could trust to mean what it said. "You're coming with me," he said, and though he was looking at the crowd, Sarah knew the words were meant for her. "Now hold on." Thomas pushed forward. "You can't just take her. And those are my daughters." "Your daughters." Caleb's voice dropped even quieter, which somehow made it more dangerous. 5 minutes ago, you were standing there watching people throw stones at their mother. That sounds like a father to you. I got rights. You dissolved the marriage. You threw her out. You told your own mother-in-law not to take her in. You've made it real clear you don't want any of them. Caleb's hand moved to rest on something at his belt. Sarah realized with a cold shock that it was a gun. He wasn't touching it threateningly, just letting everyone know it was there. "So I'm going to ask you once, you got some legal claim to these people that I need to know about?" Thomas's face went red, then white. It's not. That's what I thought." Caleb turned slightly, addressing the crowd now. "Anyone else got an objection? Because I'm taking this woman and her daughters to my ranch. They'll have food, shelter, and safety. If any of you have a problem with that, speak now." The silence stretched out. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Mary's small body trembling against her. Finally, Margaret Hutchins spoke up, her voice uncertain now. "It's not right, a single man taking in a woman like that. People will talk. People are already talking. Seems to me their talk can't get much worse than standing by while a mother gets stoned in front of her children." Caleb's gaze swept the crowd, and Sarah saw more than one person look away. "I'll have Mrs. Chen from the general store come out tomorrow to serve as chaperone until we can get things properly arranged. That satisfy your sense of propriety?" No one answered. Caleb turned back to Sarah. The hardness left his face when he looked at her, replaced by something almost gentle. "I've got a wagon just over there. Can you walk, or should I carry you?" "I can walk," Sarah whispered. Her voice came out hoarse, barely audible. "I can walk." But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Before she could fall, Caleb caught her, one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "Girls," he said, looking down at the 3 small faces staring up at him with identical expressions of terror and hope, "you follow close now. We're going home." The wagon ride north seemed to exist outside of time. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of the steady rhythm of horses' hooves and the creak of wooden wheels. Someone had wrapped her in a blanket that smelled like hay and wood smoke. Clean smells. Safe smells. She woke fully when the wagon stopped. Evening had fallen, painting everything in shades of blue and gold. The ranch house before them was simple but well-maintained, a solid structure of logs and stone with smoke rising from the chimney. Beyond it, she could see a barn and several outbuildings, all showing signs of careful upkeep. "Home," Caleb said simply, setting the brake. He climbed down and came around to Sarah's side of the wagon. "Let me help you." This time, Sarah managed to stand on her own, though she had to lean on the wagon for support. Her whole body ached, and she was fairly certain she looked like she'd lost a fight with a bear. The twins were asleep in the wagon bed, curled together under another blanket, but Mary stood beside her mother, wide-eyed and silent. Caleb lifted the twins with practiced ease, one in each arm. "There's a room just off the kitchen that should work," he said, heading toward the house. "Used to be a hired hand's quarters, but it's been empty a while. Clean, though. I'll get a fire going." Sarah followed, each step sending fresh waves of pain through her bruised body. Mary held her hand, squeezing tight. Inside, the house was spare but tidy. A man's house, clearly, with few decorations and a lot of practical furniture. But it was warm, and it was clean, and no one here wanted to throw stones at her. The room Caleb showed them to was small but serviceable. A bed large enough for all four of them, a dresser, a chair. A window that looked out over the darkening prairie. He laid the sleeping twins on the bed with surprising gentleness, then straightened. "I'll bring food in a bit," he said. "And water for washing. There's a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer." Sarah stared at him. "Why?" The word came out raw. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "Because somebody should have," he said finally. "Because those girls need their mother. And because I know what it's like to lose everything and have nobody care." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Get some rest. We'll figure out the details tomorrow." He was gone before Sarah could respond, the door closing softly behind him. She stood there, swaying slightly, Mary still clutching her hand. Then, slowly, she sank down onto the edge of the bed and let herself cry. Not the silent, desperate tears she'd shed in the town square, but great, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Mary climbed into her lap, small arms wrapping around her neck. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered, the way Sarah had whispered to her through 100 childhood hurts. "It's okay now." And somehow, impossibly, Sarah thought it might be. The next few days passed in a blur of healing and adjustment. Mrs. Chen did indeed arrive the morning after, a practical woman in her 60s who took one look at Sarah's battered face and immediately set to work with poultices and stern instructions about rest. She stayed through the day, cooking meals and helping with the girls, all while maintaining the fiction that she was there to preserve propriety rather than to help. Sarah learned that Caleb had been widowed 6 years ago. His wife, Elizabeth, had died of fever, and he'd been running the ranch alone ever since. He kept a few head of cattle, some chickens, a vegetable garden that he clearly struggled to maintain properly. It was a lonely life but a stable one. The girls adapted with the resilience of children. Mary was cautious at first, watching Caleb with wary eyes whenever he entered a room. But the twins, too young to fully understand what had happened, simply accepted that this quiet man with gentle hands was part of their lives now. By the third day, they were following him around the ranch like ducklings, chattering away while he did his chores. Sarah watched from the window as Caleb showed them how to scatter feed for the chickens. He moved slowly, demonstrating with exaggerated care, and then stepped back to let them try. When the twins threw the grain with wild enthusiasm, sending it everywhere except where it was supposed to go, he didn't scold. He just smiled, a small, rare expression that transformed his severe face, and showed them again. "He's good with them," Mrs. Chen said, coming to stand beside Sarah. "Natural father, if you ask me. Shame he never had children of his own." Sarah's bruises were fading from purple to yellow-green, and the cut on her temple had closed cleanly. But the wounds inside felt deeper. "Mrs. Chen," she said quietly, "people in town are going to talk. About me being here. About him taking us in. People always talk." Mrs. Chen snorted. "Let them. What that man did took courage. Standing up to the whole town like that. Bitter Springs ought to be ashamed, and some of them are, though they won't admit it yet. Thomas might try to make trouble. Thomas is a coward who let a mob attack the mother of his children. Even the men who agreed with him think less of him now." Mrs. Chen patted Sarah's shoulder. "You're safe here, dear. Caleb Harper's a man of his word. If he says you're under his protection, you're under his protection. That night, after Mrs. Chen had left and the girls were asleep, Sarah ventured out into the main room. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, working through a ledger by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, his expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "Should you be up?" he asked. "I'm fine. Healing well." Sarah hesitated, then moved closer. "Mr. Harper, I need to talk to you about what happens next." "Caleb," he said. "If we're living under the same roof, might as well use first names." "Caleb, then." She sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table to keep them from shaking. "I'm grateful for what you've done. More grateful than I can ever express. But I can't stay here indefinitely. People will talk, and you don't deserve to have your reputation damaged because you helped us." Caleb closed the ledger, giving her his full attention. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Got a proposal, if you're willing to hear it." Sarah's heart started beating faster. "What kind of proposal?" "The practical kind." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the purchase of livestock. "I need help running this place. Garden's half wild, house needs a woman's touch, and I'm tired of eating my own cooking. You need safety and security for yourself and your girls. Seems to me a marriage would solve both problems." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah stared at him, trying to read something in that granite face. "You're proposing marriage? To me? You barely know me." "Know enough. You're a hard worker, from what Mrs. Chen says. Good mother. And you're not looking for romance or sweet words, same as me." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "I'm not offering you love, Sarah. I'm offering you a partnership. A home. Legal protection that nobody can challenge. Your girls would have my name, my inheritance. You'd have status as my wife. And what would you get? A ranch that's properly cared for. Hot meals. Maybe someday someone to talk to in the evenings." He paused. "And a family. I won't lie and say I don't want that. House has been too quiet too long." Sarah looked down at her hands. They were rough from years of work, calloused and scarred. Not the hands of a woman who inspired romantic proposals. "I can't give you sons," she said quietly. "Everyone says I'm cursed. Everyone's a fool." Caleb's voice was firm. "I've got 3 bright little girls under my roof right now who are proof you can create life just fine. And if God sees fit to give us more children, we'll welcome whatever He sends. If not, well, I'll have 3 daughters. Seems like a blessing to me." She looked up, searching his face. "Why? Why would you tie yourself to me like this? You could find someone younger, someone without baggage. I'm 43 years old, Sarah. I'm not looking for some starry-eyed girl who thinks marriage is a fairy tale. I'm looking for a partner who understands that life is hard work and you get through it by standing together." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to work beside me. To build something solid. Is that something you can do?" Sarah thought about the town square. About the stones and the jeers. About Thomas's cold eyes as he declared her worthless. About her own mother turning her away. Then she thought about her daughters, sleeping peacefully in the next room for the first time in days. About this quiet man who had stepped between her and violence without hesitation. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford. But partnership? Safety? A future for her girls? Those were treasures beyond price. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I can do that." Caleb nodded once, as if she'd agreed to help with the spring planting rather than marry him. "Good. I'll ride to town tomorrow and arrange things with the minister. We'll do it proper, with witnesses and legal papers. No one will be able to say the marriage isn't legitimate." He stood, clearly considering the matter settled. But Sarah stopped him with a hand on his arm. He looked down at her, surprised. "Thank you," she said softly. "For seeing worth where everyone else saw shame." Something flickered in his eyes then, something almost like pain. "We all deserve to be seen, Sarah. Even when we're broken. Maybe especially then." He gently pulled his arm free and headed toward his own room. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." The wedding took place 4 days later in the small church in Bitter Springs. Caleb had insisted on it, refusing to hide or skulk around as if they were doing something shameful. Mrs. Chen stood as witness, along with old Mr. Rodriguez from the land office. The minister performed the ceremony with stiff disapproval clear on his face, but he performed it nonetheless. Caleb's quiet insistence and the legal weight of his position as a property owner had ensured that. Sarah wore a simple dress that Mrs. Chen had altered to fit her, her bruises mostly faded now but still visible if you knew to look. The girl sat in the front pew, dressed in clean pinafores that Caleb had somehow procured. Mary watched the proceedings with solemn eyes, while the twins kicked their feet and whispered to each other. When the minister asked if Caleb would take Sarah as his lawful wedded wife, he said "I do" in that same quiet, certain voice that had stopped a mob. When Sarah said the same words, her voice shook, but she meant them. This wasn't the marriage she'd imagined as a girl, but it was real and solid, and that was worth more than any romantic dream. Caleb slipped a simple gold band on her finger. His own hands were steady, and when their eyes met, she saw a promise there. Not of passion or poetry, but of something perhaps more valuable, constancy. They emerged from the church as husband and wife. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity and gossip. Sarah saw Thomas at the edge of the group, his face twisted with something between anger and humiliation. Margaret Hutchins whispered urgently to her companions, no doubt spreading fresh poison. Caleb ignored them all. He helped Sarah into the wagon, lifted the girls up after her, and took his seat at the reins. Then he turned to address the watching crowd. "This is my wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "These are my daughters. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my family alone." He didn't wait for a response. Just clicked to the horses and drove them out of town, leaving Bitter Springs and its judgment behind. The ranch felt different when they returned as a family. Mrs. Chen had left a meal warming in the oven, and the house smelled like fresh bread and stew. Caleb carried the twins inside while Mary helped Sarah down from the wagon. They ate together at the kitchen table, a new configuration that would become their normal. Husband, wife, and 3 daughters. That night, after the girls were in bed, Sarah stood uncertainly in the main room. She knew there were expectations that came with marriage, even practical ones. But Caleb simply pointed to the room that had been hers. "That's your space," he said. "For now. Until you decide otherwise. I'm not going to demand what you're not ready to give, Sarah. We've got time to figure out what this marriage is going to be." Relief and something else, something she couldn't quite name, flooded through her. "Thank you," she said again, the word seeming inadequate for the gift he was giving her. He just nodded and headed to his own room, leaving her to find her way in this new life. Spring came to the ranch with a burst of wildflowers and new grass. Sarah threw herself into the work of making the place a true home. She tamed the wild garden, planted vegetables and herbs, cleaned every corner of the house until it shone. She learned Caleb's routines and rhythms, learned when he wanted conversation and when he needed silence. He was a man of few words, but the words he did speak carried weight. The girls bloomed like the prairie flowers. Mary started to smile again, then laugh. The twins grew bolder, their voices filling the quiet house with chatter and songs. Caleb built them a swing near the barn, and Sarah would watch from the kitchen window as he pushed them, his face softening into that rare smile. He was patient with them in ways that amazed her. When they tracked mud through the house, he helped them clean it up and showed them where to leave their boots. When the twins got into a screaming fight over a rag doll, he sat them down and talked to them quietly until they were hugging and apologizing. When Mary had nightmares about the town square, he was the one who heard her crying and sat beside her bed, his presence alone enough to chase the bad dreams away. Sarah watched him become a father, and something in her chest began to thaw. She'd married him for practical reasons, for safety and survival. But she was beginning to realize that she'd gotten far more than she'd bargained for. One evening in early summer, after the girls were asleep, they sat on the porch together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. It had become a habit, this quiet time together. Sometimes they talked about the ranch, about what needed doing. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Tonight, Caleb was the one who broke it. "You're happy here?" he asked. "You and the girls?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said. "Happier than I've been in a long time. Maybe ever." He nodded, still looking out at the darkening prairie. "Good. That's good." A pause. "I've been thinking about what you said that night. About how you can't give me sons." Sarah felt her body tense. This was it, then. The moment he'd admit that 3 daughters weren't enough, that he needed more. "I don't want sons," Caleb said quietly. "I want those 3 girls in there to grow up knowing they're valuable. That they're wanted. That they're enough, exactly as they are." He turned to look at her then, his eyes serious in the fading light. "And I want you to know the same thing, Sarah. You're not here because I settled for you. You're here because I chose you. I'd make the same choice again tomorrow." The tears came before Sarah could stop them. "Caleb, I know this wasn't what you planned. Wasn't what I planned either. But it's what we have, and I'm grateful for it. For you. For them." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I'm not good with fancy words. But I want you to know that this marriage, this family we're building, it's real to me. It matters." Sarah squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat there as darkness fell, hands clasped, while the stars came out overhead. And for the first time since she'd been a girl, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. For joy. For belonging. For home. Inside the house, Mary had woken from sleep and crept to the window. She watched her mother and her new father sitting close together on the porch, saw their joined hands, saw her mother's tears and the gentleness on Caleb's face. And she smiled, because even at 5 years old, she understood that they were safe now. That they were home. The summer brought changes beyond the ranch. Word spread through Bitter Springs and the surrounding territory about the Harper family. About how those 3 little girls were thriving. About how Sarah had transformed from a beaten, broken woman into someone confident and strong. About how Caleb Harper, the stern widower who'd kept to himself for 6 years, now smiled regularly and seemed 10 years younger. People began to reconsider. Maybe it hadn't been right, what they'd done in the town square. Maybe Thomas had been the problem, not Sarah. Maybe those girls weren't cursed after all. Thomas himself had remarried quickly, taking a young woman barely 20 who he was certain would give him sons. But his new wife wasn't pregnant, and people were starting to whisper that perhaps the fault had never been Sarah's to begin with. He'd see the Harpers sometimes, when they came to town for supplies, and the sight of Sarah's peaceful face and those happy, healthy girls would twist something in his gut. He'd thrown away something precious, and they all knew it now. Margaret Hutchins had tried to maintain her righteous stance, but even she found it hard to justify stoning a woman whose only crime had been giving birth to daughters. Especially when those daughters were as bright and charming as the Harper girls clearly were. When she ran into them at the general store one day and the twins gave her identical gap-toothed grins, something cracked in her hardened heart. By autumn, the transformation was nearly complete. Caleb and Sarah made the journey to town for the Harvest Festival, and this time people smiled at them. Tentatively at first, uncertain of their reception, but warming when the Harpers responded with grace rather than grudges. Mary entered the children's recitation contest and won, her clear voice ringing out as she spoke the poem Caleb had helped her memorize. The twins charmed everyone with their matching dimples and boundless energy. And Sarah, standing beside her husband with her head high, no longer looked like a victim. She looked like a woman who knew her worth. Mrs. Chen watched it all with satisfaction. She'd known from the start that Caleb Harper was a man of honor, and she'd been right. The best revenge, she thought, wasn't anger or bitterness. It was living well. And the Harper family was living very well indeed. That night, back at the ranch, Sarah tucked the girls into bed with extra hugs and kisses. They'd had a wonderful day, full of games and treats and the simple joy of belonging. Mary was already asleep before her head hit the pillow, the twins not far behind. Sarah found Caleb on the porch again, their usual spot. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. They'd been doing that more often lately, finding excuses to be near each other. His hand would brush hers as they worked in the garden. Her shoulder would lean into his as they reviewed the account books. Small touches, tentative but meaningful. Today was good, she said softly. The girls were so happy. They weren't the only ones. Caleb looked at her, his eyes warm in the lamplight spilling from the windows. You were happy too. I could see it. I was. Sarah turned to face him fully. Caleb, I need to tell you something. When we married, I thought I understood what I was agreeing to. A partnership? An arrangement. Something practical and sensible. His expression grew guarded. And now? Now I realize I was wrong. She took a deep breath. Somewhere between that first day and now, this became more than an arrangement. Somewhere in the quiet evenings and the shared work and the watching you be a father to my daughters, I fell in love with you. Caleb went very still. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Sarah's heart started to sink. She'd ruined it. She'd broken the unspoken agreement that had made this marriage work. Then he reached up and cupped her face with his calloused hand, his thumb gently tracing the scar left by a stone on that terrible day in the town square. Sarah, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I loved you the moment you tried to stand on your own instead of letting me carry you. When you were battered and broken and had every reason to give up, but you stood anyway because your daughters needed you to. He leaned his forehead against hers. I just didn't think I had the right to say it. Didn't want to ask for more than you could give. You have the right, she whispered. You've always had the right. You gave me back my life, Caleb. You gave my daughters a future. You gave us all a home. You gave me just as much. His other hand found hers, lacing their fingers together. You gave me a reason to hope again. To believe that good things could still happen. To remember what it feels like to be part of a family. They kissed then, tentative at first and then with growing confidence. It wasn't the passionate embrace of a romance novel. It was something better, a promise. A commitment. A recognition that what they'd built together was worth cherishing. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. Caleb stood and held out his hand to Sarah. Come on, Mrs. Harper. Let's go inside. She took his hand and rose, following him into the warm glow of their home. Behind them, the prairie stretched out under a canopy of stars, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own work and worry. But tonight, they had this, a family forged not from obligation but from choice. From courage. From the simple but profound act of seeing worth where others saw only shame. And in the bedroom where three little girls slept peacefully, unaware of the joy their presence had brought to two broken people, the future waited. A future full of laughter and love, of hard work and harvest, of growing together into something neither Caleb nor Sarah could have imagined that day in the town square. It was a future worth fighting for. And they had one.